Brad,
Good morning.
good morning. How are you?
Doing extremely well and so thankful and excited to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm just checking, make sure the stream is going everywhere it's supposed to go, and it appears to be. So we're going to jump right in and tell people what's going on. How's that sound?
As long as we don't break the internet.
I will. Looking at our two mugs, we'll definitely break the internet. So welcome to Cultivated Daily for Tuesday, February 20th, 2024. We're calling this episode 1 of this live stream. And our goal at Cultivated has been to be reader first, providing the cannabis industry with the most important, insightful, and we hope useful information to our audience on a daily basis. And until this very minute, it's almost entirely been through our daily newsletter, Cannabis Daily. And while we certainly would love to have everybody here subscribe, and I'll put in the show notes how to actually do that, we wanted to actually add to that because we want to meet the industry where they are. And sometimes they are online, or oftentimes they are online on LinkedIn or YouTube, which is the two places that you can find this live stream. And here's what we're going to do on the show, Brad, just so you know, even though I know you know, we're going to recap the most pressing news of the day, often with a guest, in this case, Brad. Then we'll dive into a conversation with that guest, in this case, Brad. And then we'll make this all available, obviously, through a live stream on LinkedIn and Cultivated YouTube's channel. This is very unpro.
I love it.
Off button. That's the radio. That's super radio. And if you're excuse me, everybody.
Yes.
Early morning sesh. If you're watching us on YouTube, on LinkedIn, give us a follow. We'd love that. If you're watching us on YouTube, this is what the kids say, Brad. Smash the subscribe button. I want to make sure that people do that because it's a good way to follow us. This whole thing is going to be about, what's that?
I still say bag it, tag it, and sell it to the butcher in the store.
I like that, Brad. That's good. And I think a lot of people will get the reference on this that watch us. And because we know you're busy, we're going to keep it hopefully at about 20, 25 minutes every day. And with that, let me welcome officially Brad Spirrison. And Brad, while I was creeping you online, which I've been doing for years, I found a one-line bio for you. Are you ready for it?
Can't wait.
Okay. Brad Spirrison is a journalist, serial entrepreneur,
yes,
and media ecologist. He lives in Chicago with his son. Interests include music, meditation, and Miles Davis. All those things still ring true?
That and alliteration.
Yes.
Includes music, meditation, Miles, and marijuana.
Yeah.
And of course, being in this moment with you.
Wow. You've really done a lot of work there. I like it.
Thank you.
You like other things too, and you're involved in other things. Yes?
Very much. So I am the founder of Grown In, which is a cannabis media platform started in late 2019 with a focus on cannabis industry information, education, and live events. And I'm also very recently the director of business development for Accountability, which is a membership-driven advertising co-op for the cannabis industry.
I like it. And I saw that come across. I was going to ask you about that, but now that you've sort of usurped that, I guess you've removed that question from the talking points. But in addition to all of those things, there's other things too. So Grown In, Accountability. You're the resident entrepreneur of the cannabis vertical at 1871 in Chicago. Is that right?
Yes. We run the Cannabis Innovation Lab,
okay,
which is in cooperation with a group called 1871. 1871 is a world-renowned business incubator based in Chicago. 1871 is named after the year of the Chicago fire, but more importantly, the rebuild that comes after it. So for the last decade plus, the entity started by Governor J.B. Pritzker and potentially President J.B. Pritzker a year from now. We shall see. We created it as a mechanism originally to help digital companies emerge in Chicago and beyond, and more recently, other verticals, including cannabis.
I like it. I like cannabis a lot.
Big fan.
Yeah, big fan. Which brings me to this point about us, you and I. Although don't tell the people at Emory this. You and I lived in adjoining, I guess they're adjoining or back-to-back dorm rooms our first year in university at Emory. That's a big coincidence, no?
Yeah. That gives us 30 years to creep. It was before even we could creep each other online. We were doing it on CD-ROMs, I think, in the early to mid 90s. And, there's a number of us from memory that are in the industry today. And it was so wonderful to reconnect with you, golly, 3-4 years ago. And of course, something had to be in the water back in Georgia during that time in order for us to be doing remarkably similar things in this industry. And that is what brings us here today.
I love it. I love it. And Brad, I have to say this because you're throwing out lyrics all the time. What a long, strange trip it's been. So welcome.
It's so great to be here, Jay.
I'm glad you are. And this is what we're going to do. You're the first one to do this, but we're going to run through the news of the day.
Awesome.
Comment as you see fit. I'll ask you some questions while we go through, and then we'll get to sort of more of why we're actually here and you're the guest today. Okay, you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, so like a lot of days, today's news is going to start in New York. And for those people who either live in New York or don't live in New York, but read the New Yorker, like my father-in-law, correspondent Gia Tolentino took a deep and sometimes scathing eye to what's going on with New York's social justice-focused cannabis program. And the results are certainly worth anybody's full read, although I know a lot of people don't read the full New Yorker articles. They're quite long, but anybody interested in cannabis legalization, the promise and pitfalls of using legalization as a form of economic empowerment, here are some takeaways from the piece. The perspective is similar to really what everybody has been saying, is that red tape, lawsuits, and perhaps lack of enforcement have plunged New York's once exciting cannabis rollout into, I'll say the word chaos, even though the governor used the word disaster. So I don't know if chaos or disaster is worse, but I'm not the governor. She's using the word disaster. And actually, Brad, I don't know if you saw the quote from Tremaine Wright, who's the chair of the Cannabis Control Board. She said on Friday, it's been a rocky start to cannabis in 2024. I like that she used 2024. We've read your letters and heard your concerns. That's how she started a meeting. Has it been a rocky start to 2024, or was the rocky start actually way before then?
Well, I think the original Rocky was in like 1976, but it's so complicated in every state. I would say in New York, if you can bake it there, you could bake it anywhere. And, Rocky is, of course it's rocky. It's been rocky everywhere. We're going to talk a little bit later about other rollouts that we've seen over the years. But what I would caution as somebody that has spent some time looking at other ascending markets is a little bit of patience. It's like technology. And I've been covering technology for the last 25 years. It's always more expensive and it always takes longer. We're in the middle of a morass. Of course, it's rocky. But I do believe there's light at the end of the tunnel. It's just easy for me to say that, having not been in the market and dealing with, trying to get licensure, trying to get up and running, everything else. But I would not lose hope.
But Brad, you've been in the tunnel in other places, in Illinois most notably, and that didn't seem like the smoothest rollout from a distance either. Like, I guess the question is, why can't states get it less wrong every time?
Well, this stuff is really, really hard. When I say this stuff, I mean standing up a legal state-specific market in a federally illegal enterprise by itself is extraordinarily difficult. When you layer in the very progressive intent of social equity aspirations, giving ownership to this cannabis industry to communities and individuals most adversely impacted by the war on drugs, it adds another level of complexity. So New York is probably the 8th or 9th different state right now in the United States that has done this. And having spent my time in Illinois, what I could tell you is, 18 months ago, Illinois was in the same exact position in the middle of litigation. And it takes time for the system to roll out. Right now, the struggle in Illinois is not as much on the regulatory standpoint as it relates to new entities opening up, but more on the capital environments, which is something that hopefully we're going to find relief to. So, in Illinois, there, at the onset of adult use legalization, there were some upwards of 110 dispensaries. Now there are close to 200 dispensaries. Now that, and all of that is basically within the last 12 months, and we're opening up at a clip of 2, 3, 4, maybe 1 or 2 per week, and 5 to 10 per month.
Okay.
So it's happening. It will happen in New York. If you look at other states, New Jersey, Massachusetts, it's non-linear, right. But when things open up, it tends to become a more functional market.
Yeah. You mentioned the word tough. This is the segue to the next story. My home state, Massachusetts, our senator, she's very tough, Senator Elizabeth Warren. She was on Pod Save America, I think it was last week, and the podcast, if you don't know, it's hosted by former Obama aides. They've actually created a pretty successful media company. And they discussed on the podcast the progress of cannabis reform, particularly her push for descheduling. First, are you a friend of the pod?
I'm a friend of the pod. I used it for, let's call it, spiritual sustenance during the Trump administration. I have not had to rely upon it as much in recent years, but know it well, and have been following what Senator Warren said.
Yeah, I work with a bunch of, I guess they're millennials or young millennials. And when I told them that I listened to Pod Save America, they said, Jay, you are so center left. I think it was an insult with the way they said it. I'm pretty sure it was. Nonetheless, on the podcast, Senator Warren said, and this is a quote, she wasn't going to discuss private conversations with the federal government on the DEA regarding cannabis. But then this is the best, and it's hard to do this on a podcast. She actually winked at the host, Jon Favreau, which I think indicated something. And then he mentioned that she had winked at him, essentially saying, something's going on, I just can't talk about it, I think is what the intention of the wink was. But just to catch you up, I know you know, but folks watching, including Senator Warren, and 11 other senators sent a letter to the DEA basically saying, hurry up, what's the wait? And by the way, we don't want to see rescheduling, we actually want to see descheduling. She ended the podcast by saying, I really want to say to the DEA, guys, come on, it's not 1958, and we don't need to be terrified of this stuff. Let's just deschedule it and go forward. But yet we're still waiting, obviously, for the DEA to make their decision. Is it a good idea for Senator Warren to be making fun of the DEA? I guess that's my question.
Well, you joked about being described as center left. She would be further left on the spectrum. If it were coming from a politician that was more in the middle, I would be a little bit scared. But if it's Senator Warren, if it's Bernie Sanders, if it's AOC or others, you kind of expect and almost rely upon them to, from a liberal or a progressive standpoint, really call out what's practically the best idea, but politically has zero to little chance of actually being implemented. Yeah. We need people on that front. We need Senator Warren on that lead wall.
Right. We want her on that wall.
Descheduling seems to be, impossible at this juncture. I don't think, however, it's going to impact what I think will happen with rescheduling, which is a very real and some might say imminent possibility.
What's the over under in terms of date when that's going to happen? Are they going to wait till 420? Like, is this going to be some?
I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be a matter of weeks. I think the State of the Union address is March 5th.
Yeah.
And here we sit on February 20th. I think that there's a very real chance it's going to happen in the next 2 weeks.
I like it. Well,
over under. I will say March 1st.
Okay, I like it. And we're going to get to that in 1 second. So hold that thought, Brad.
Yes.
That is today's rundown of the Cultivated Daily News. Again, give us a follow on LinkedIn. Give us a subscribe on YouTube, but also subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. There's a link certainly on LinkedIn right now. There's a link to how to actually do that. We encourage you to do that as well. This is a segue, Brad. Are you ready?
Segue. I'm riding it.
Okay. Brad, a few weeks back, you had me on a panel discussing during one of your immersive weeks of cannabis. Talk a bit about what you're doing with these immersive weeks. I think it's actually quite interesting. Give us a rundown of sort of what that is and what you're talking about.
So Grown in coordination with 1871 runs Cannabis Innovation Lab. What that means is for 1 week every month for the first 4 months of this year, we just wrapped up our February cohort. We have another virtual thing in March. We have a series of really programs like this. Panel conversations on everything from rescheduling to venture capital financing to hemp derived THC versus the licensed. We have a lot of programming and mentorship. The core audience are 18 different startup companies that come from all over the country and, to some extent all over the world, trying to develop their cannabis 3.0 businesses. The big event that we have coming up on April 17th is the Cannabis Innovation Summit. And we recently announced our keynote is the one and only Jim Belushi of Belushi's Farm.
I like that. That's cool.
We're on a mission from Ganja God.
I like that. That's pretty good. You got a lot up your sleeve. And out of one of those immersive weeks where I was on a panel talking cannabis and politics, really, and sort of what I was looking to in the coming year. You and I talked offline and wanted to build a podcast specifically about sort of the intersection of cannabis and politics. And so this is part of it. This is going to be the first episode of what we're calling United States of Cannabis. We're going to put up a graphic so people can see. So this is, yeah. So that's the graphic. We're going to create a podcast of really the intersection again, because it is one, it's an election year that is interesting. Two, so much is really at the intersection of cannabis and politics. Most of the things we talked about at the top of the show. But let me ask you, when you're thinking about cannabis and politics and the United States of cannabis, where would you want to start?
Well, first off, even before we get to that, I think the millennials will say we've manifested our idea.
It was on our vision board, Brad.
Well, if it's on the vision board, then it has to happen. You can't have something on the vision board and not actually make it happen. So in answer to your question, I think the United States of politics always starts at the presidential level. And you're going to say, well, it seems pretty obvious. Biden has lukewarm, but, credible support for the cannabis industry. And Trump to date has not been at all supportive, but as we know, he's a complete wild card and at any given moment can change direction. What I find fascinating is to what degree will President Biden begin to support more forcefully regulation? We talked about rescheduling being an announcement at the State of the Union address. I think that is going to be key. Why is this going to be key? Because in a very close election where young and undecided voters, particularly in swing states, are going to probably decide who the next leader of the free world is, they're going to look for he's going to look for every possible reason to not only, I don't know if you're going to convert voters from one to the other, but you need to mobilize voters that are on the fence and would otherwise, sit at home. And, rather than sitting at home smoking a joint, why not use pot policy as a reason to activate those voters in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Colorado, in Virginia, and the handful of other states? Jay, how do you see this?
Well, some of those states I quite like, and I worked on Capitol Hill. After I left you in Atlanta, I worked for U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer. Maybe she was like the Elizabeth Warren before Elizabeth Warren was, although I think Elizabeth Warren's really, really talented. So did Senator Boxer, but not as talented necessarily as Elizabeth Warren. And I always err on the side of delay, being disappointed, and the status quo being the go-to position for anything and everyone in DC. I mean, just look at sort of firearms in the US. But something like cannabis, while it is like super important to you and I understand what you're saying about mobilizing voters, it's not always front and center for anybody in DC. But there's also a lot of weed in DC. That's an aside. Like it's everywhere there, and certainly Maryland just legalized. But I am actually, where you're zigging towards the federal government, I'm actually zagging, I think, towards some state government politics and policy. And three in particular that I'm watching, although one I think is now by the wayside. Wisconsin. So these are all relatively purple states, let's say. Mm-hmm. Wisconsin, where Republicans are in charge of the legislature, they have a Democratic governor. Voters really want legalization. So does the governor. The governor said he would sign something less than sort of adult use. and Republicans put forward something that even Republicans couldn't agree on because it had like state-owned dispensaries. So, but I think Wisconsin, something's going to happen, not this legislative session, but something's going to happen. I think Pennsylvania is interesting. The governor there, Josh Shapiro, came out and said, we actually need we need legalized cannabis to balance our budget. And here's where the money's going to go. This was in his budget message a few weeks back. And that obviously is a very interesting state on a political level, but also it is purplish and massive. Like it's a very big state. So it has major implications for the industry. So I think what's going to happen in Pennsylvania this year in particular is very interesting. And then Florida. And this is what we talked about on the panel that you hosted. One, it's a presidential year. Florida is, even though they usually go red, like it is interesting. And it seems to be that they will have a ballot measure in November legalizing cannabis. And this goes directly to your point. Can it mobilize some set of voters that either wouldn't necessarily vote or need a little bit motivation to vote? I don't think it's going to change anybody's mind, but it might get some young people, pro-cannabis people, to the ballot in November in Florida, which may have an impact, or at least may make it even closer in Florida. So Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida is where my eyes are for this year. But let me ask you even a more specific question, not generally where we want to take the podcast, but what about next week? What would you want to see? Do you want to wait and see, see what happens?
As we said, one thing in particular to riff off what you said about those three particular states, if you look at not only the political equation, but also the commercial equation. So Wisconsin is a state, obviously, that borders Illinois, which I know very well, being based in Chicago. And, you could look at, Chicago, the land of the MSOs. Green Thumb has a border dispensary. Cresco has a border dispensary at Wisconsin. What we saw when Missouri went rec and then adult use recreational, when went medical and then adult use recreational, is like those border locations. And that point, Ascend had one that was doing hundreds of thousands of dollars per day.
Yeah.
And so you also look at the commercial ramifications of a state like Wisconsin. Pennsylvania, I just can't believe it's not already rec. And Florida, even though it isn't rec, is still a multi-billion-dollar market. Back to what we're going to talk about next week, I think that there's a very good chance that there's going to be rescheduling in the next 10 to 15 days. So I think we should put our heads together, find an expert who is situated to talk about such things, and allow us to play a little bit of convener on this cannabis subject.
So let me put a call out. If anybody listening to this or watching this knows Elizabeth Warren's press person, her name right in there. This Cultivated is like, really, you got to get on there. No, we'll find, yes, but we will also find someone to join us, talk about rescheduling probably next week. We'll announce that as we go. That's not all, Brad, though. Like, in addition to us going to university together, in addition to the podcast, we have more stuff doing together, and this is super exciting. We're going to be, it's a strategic partnership between Cultivated and Grown In, which I'm super jazzed about, where folks who are part of the Grown In world are going to be part of the Cultivated world and get the daily newsletter. That's exciting, no?
I can't believe it. So for me, when Cultivated launched in last fall, it immediately became a must-read publication for me. The way that you distill everything that everyone should know about in the cannabis industry, and you scour and you also invest more increasingly in original reporting. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce the Grown In audience to Cultivated and make sure that Grown In readers, followers, subscribers, supporters have the opportunity to take advantage of such terrific analysis and coverage. And I can't wait to begin unrolling this in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, I'm really excited. This is like super exciting. And so we'll kick that off in the next week. So if you're Grown In person, welcome. If you're a Cultivated person, let's welcome our new friends from Grown In. We're all going to get along fabulously.
Yes.
And Brad, thank you for joining us on episode 1, which now when I say that, it sounds a lot like a Star Wars movie. Not my favorite Star Wars movie, but I don't want to talk about Star Wars, but Not a bad one, but it is certainly one.
Relative to the rest, it's a bad one.
It's fine. It's fine. It's one of the ones you should watch if you haven't already.
I used to get my weed in a jar, and I would call it Jar Jar Binks. So
that's pretty good. It's the best part of that character is that you can actually use that as a weed thing.
Yeah.
Brad, not you, but I will be back here tomorrow. I'll actually be back with my co-founder at Cultivated, Jeremy Burke, for episode 2, which is not yet a Star Wars movie. But Brad, thanks for joining us. We look forward to kicking things off on the podcast, on the partnership, and thanks for making time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to many, many more episodes ahead.
I'm excited as well. You'll be back. Sorry, I should say you'll be back on Tuesdays.
Yes.
That's what we're going to do. And the reason why Tuesdays is election days in the States are always on Tuesday. And so we thought it would be a good lead in. We can always count down to elections if we do it on Tuesday. So Brad, thank you very much. Thank you to the Grown In folks. Thank you to Cultivated. Thanks for everybody watching here today. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, smash the subscribe button. If you're on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn, and we will see you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern, right here on Cultivated.